Hello and welcome to the latest instalment of The Conquered and the Proud, our lecture series looking at the development of Roman rule from 200-ish BC right the way through to about 200 AD. So we've got chronologically into the late 1st century. We looked at the Flavians last time. Today we're going to be looking at a broader question, which will mean going a little bit back and forth, although we'll try and keep things focused on, broadly speaking, the last half anyway, of the 1st century AD, but there will be examples from either side. And the big question we're going to ask today is whether the Roman Empire was maintained by force. Now, we all know that it's conquered in the first place. It's there in the title. This large expanse of land stretching from what would become Scotland, the Atlantic coast, the Rhine, the Danube, beyond in places like Dacia, out to the Euphrates and sometimes beyond in the east, the Sahara Desert in North Africa. A huge area comes under Roman rule, and this didn't happen by chance or because everybody suddenly spontaneously decided, wouldn't it be fun to be all part of some big friendly Roman Empire and Union? Some people do join the Roman Empire voluntarily and never fight the Romans, but basically speaking, the story is one of conquest. So conquest is one thing. There is clearly violence, military force, political pressure. All of these things come in at that stage. But what happens afterwards? There are famous rebellions. We talked a few sessions ago about Boudicca's rebellion in Britain. And we've mentioned a little bit the Jewish rebellion under Nero that was suppressed by Vespasian and Titus that really made possible Vespasian's bid for the imperial throne. We'll talk more about that because that's an interesting example from the middle of this period, and the whole story of the Jewish response to the Roman Empire is interesting because it is better documented than that of many other peoples, and then we have to judge, well, is this typical or is this not? Are there other peculiarities that in part are reflected by the fact that we have more information about this group that might mean that their experience is a little bit different, or can we generalize and say that what's happening here is probably happening elsewhere as well? Now, I've written a book, Pax Romana, which goes into these questions in much greater detail than we can possibly cover today. It's also rather fortunate that in the last few weeks I've been posting videos about the whole grand strategy question, and one of the issues within that, the reaction to the idea that the Romans are centrally planning everything and also that their main aim is defensive. Although scholars have emphasized that actually the Romans can stay pretty aggressive until fairly late, but also that the Roman army might be an army of occupation in many regions, and we shouldn't be thinking of it as protecting a vulnerable civilian population. Rather, we should think of it perhaps as oppressing that civilian population. So it's questions like that that we'll be dealing with today. So this links in largely by chance, because it's simply how I've been doing the videos. It wasn't all planned from the start, other than in a very loose sense, to give us an idea of one more aspect of that. So this fits in very well, this whole question of, is the army primarily there to protect? Is it the wall around the empire, like the wall around a city of Greek orators like Aelius, Aristides, people we've referred to in some of those talks? Or is it a brutal, repressive power that is, has its boot on the neck of the poor civilian population and forces them to be Roman, and that the Roman Empire is maintained by, perhaps not constant, but the threat of force and periodic applications of that force, and by the sense that it is so powerful that you simply can't oppose it. Now, we'll come back to this a little bit later, but Josephus, in speeches he gives to Herod Agrippa II, for instance, in his account of the Jewish rebellion, tries to make the case to the would-be rebels, saying, well, you can try rebelling if you like, but you're not going to win. Look throughout the world. The Romans are bigger. The Romans are better at fighting. Their army is really good. They'll always win in the end. So, why take the losses, the casualties, the suffering that will be inevitable in war? You might as well just accept the fact and get the best deal you can from them. So there's clearly an element to that. The Romans are powerful. They are conquerors in the first place. But then, when we come to issues like this, it's rather like the initial case of the causes of Roman imperialism, the nature of Roman imperialism, going back, way back to when we were starting doing this series, and the videos are there early on, when we looked at imperialism in general, then in the West, then in the East, and then in the West. In the same way as that, views of whether the Roman Empire is maintained constantly imposed by force, whether it has willing subjects or not, there's a strong political element to it, and people's interpretations of this tend to be heavily influenced by the background to when they're writing and their own political views and their own life experience. So it varies a lot, and we have to be cautious about that. It doesn't mean you can go and dismiss all of that experience, of course not. And very often that particular viewpoint will give an extra insight that is well worth thinking about. But it does mean that sometimes people have already decided. And it comes down at that fairly basic level, really, whether or not you think the Romans are a good thing, the Romans are a bad thing. I think it's even in the introduction in the the Horrible Histories series, which I weren't around when I was a kid, but my son has loved, and a lot of his friends have loved. So I've seen a lot of the TV shows, I've read lots of the books to him or bought them for him and looked through. It's the rotten Romans and people like that. And while they've emphasised everybody is fairly nasty in their titles, the groovy Greeks get a much better write-up, in spite of their warlike tendencies, than the Romans. So you can get those assumptions that will then affect how you tell that story. So we have to be very careful about understanding context to the interpretations presented at various times. And particularly you can see an overall pattern, as we'll see, where views have changed as society has changed, as the experience of the Western nations where scholars have been working has changed. And what are fashionable assumptions have influenced the way they approach the evidence and the conclusions they draw. So we're going to look a little bit at that, but we're really more interested in the causes of rebellion and why there was resistance at certain times and why there wasn't at others. And we'll come back to this because the pattern overall is not of major rebellions. And if you bear in mind just how long the Roman Empire lasted, that puts things into a different context, in that, yes, you can have nationalist ideas that survive for a very long period, but are unable to express themselves because of the power of the state that controls that particular region for generations, but nevertheless they can resurface later on. They're not necessarily in a direct line and a sort of pure, unvarnished form. There's often influences and reinterpretations of the past, sometimes with a lot of myth-making, that comes in when you get modern nationalisms. It's like the Scottish nationalists taking the Jacobite rebels as a sort of, to some extent, heroic predecessors, rather than thinking of that as a civil war for control of all of Britain. It wasn't really about Scottish nationalism. The issues were important, they were stark, the passions on both sides were very strong, but it's a rather different thing. So things can be shanghaied, and you've always got to be careful. And obviously the grossest abuse of this was in, first of all, the unification of Germany, then particularly between the First and Second World War, with the Nazis taking on sort of archaeological ideas of the purity of the German race that have lived in their forests and never been conquered by the Romans, and all this sort of thing that makes them better than all other Western Europeans who were ruled by the Romans for so long. That infected a lot of the archaeological interpretation at that time, and for some time afterwards, because many of the scholars post-war had been trained in that background. So even though they very quickly discarded the more obvious bits, there's often underlying assumptions. In the same way, as we'll see, there were underlying assumptions of many British scholars working when the British Empire was at its height in how they approached the Romans, and that view has extended in different ways. So we've got to look at the causes of resistance and rebellion, and we should remind ourselves that these often can be very complicated, and that even powerful, successful rebellions in more recent history haven't necessarily involved everybody. Prime case would be the American Revolution, where you have not only substantial numbers of loyalists who never quite get as organized as the patriots, and it's a little bit harder. There's less urgency in the and less emotional pull in the claim of, well, I think things should stay much as they are, to let's change things, this is terrible, let's overthrow the system, let's make something better. That's more impassioned, inevitably. But it's noted, by both sides, and it's part of the bad planning from the British point of view, that a lot of people in many states were unwilling to get directly involved too much of the time, partly because when you're often dealing with societies where many people are small-scale farmers, they simply cannot afford to stop working their land and go off and fight a war for months or years on end. It's why you can get a lot more militiamen on the Patriot side who can turn up for the few days either side of a battle and fight when it comes to them, but they won't go off and join the Continental Army, or they won't stay there for long, and all this sort of thing. And you could look at the misunderstandings and the complexity in what will become the Patriot cause in the build-up to the war and in the early years, and how long it takes before the decision is made openly and consciously and by the majority that this is to make an independent country rather than, in a sense, to negotiate better and get a better deal, have more self-rule, more home rule than they're getting from the British government at the time. So that's a period where there are abundant sources, where the context of it all is much easier for us to reach, much easier to understand, and it's complicated. So we shouldn't assume that when we go back to the ancient world and we look at a rebellion in one of the provinces that everything was simple and straightforward then. There are usually hints in the sources of divided councils that not everybody gets involved and all this sort of thing. But nevertheless, we just don't have that sort of detail, and we don't understand the societies involved. You've also got one other thing that we need to step back from right at the beginning, in that most areas conquered by the Romans were not unified kingdom states. They were, like Gaul, a network of different tribal groups with some subdivisions within them, with political disputes within them. Britain the same, Germany the same. Most of the provinces in Europe, the Spanish communities, particularly in those nearer the Mediterranean, the Iberian area, you have what looks very much like city-states on the Greco-Roman model, and they've been there a long time. But they're, broadly speaking, they might be able to ally occasionally with their neighbours, but they are not a single state with a single leader. If you look at the East, where there are more kingdoms, the boundaries tend to be quite fluid. So you don't have people in Commagene, or even Galatia. I mean, I think Galatia, it has been united under a king, but it's still, the distinction of the three tribal regions remains right the way through into the Roman period and beyond. You're not conquering nations that have a consciousness that we are, say, Britons or Gauls or Spaniards. And it is very striking, even when the Roman Empire falls, to leap on several centuries. You look at the 5th century AD, when the Western Empire collapses, nobody at the time is pressing to be a Briton and set up a kingdom of the Britons. They might want a local emperor who will look after your problems and defend you and promote you, rather than somebody who is more interested in other regions and never comes and never pays you any attention and doesn't do those things. But it's essentially, you want a localized version of the Roman Empire, and you don't see yourself as a breakaway in anything other than we want the government to work properly here. There is nothing like the winds of change that will sweep through the European empires in the 20th century post-Second World War, where you have strong nationalist movements and that perception that we can be a country and we should be a country and we can rule ourselves. That's not really there. You get it within particular tribal groups, particular cities, particular regions, but what you don't get are large areas thinking, well, we could be an independent kingdom and we should be. Question of Palmyra, which is after our period, is something, well, we'll deal with another time. Even that's a lot more complicated. This is very much in the context of a Roman civil war. So anyway, I'm aware of that. We might look at that in more detail at some point, but it doesn't really deal with this today. So we got to try and rid ourselves of modern nationalist ideas, and that there are large groups out there rather than lots of local groups. And in many cases, some of the kingdoms that will emerge, which you could say is true of a lot of the former European empires, the second half of the 20th century, some of the countries are largely based on administrative boundaries created by the imperial power. And that has sometimes led to friction and taken a bit of working out to how will these work as viable countries, or it's taken a while before people have come to think in those terms, that yes, I belong to that rather than I belong to my particular people, my particular group, my particular kin, my particular region. So in the Roman Empire, we just don't have that same depth of, nor even really the idea of the modern nation state and that concept. So things are very different. But let's just broadly talk about the context and the polar opposites, really, of how people approach this. And it very much mirrors, as I've said, the way they approach Roman imperialism. So if you start off with the idea that an empire can be a good thing, or is often or usually a good thing, then you tend to assume that the rule is fair and just. And that's where you get big emphasis on the idea of Pax Romana, which you then extend to sort of Pax Britannica and all this sort of thing. So when you had scholars working at the time when there were big empires around, they tended to think more favorably about the Romans. They tended to emphasize very much the civilizing force of this. You've got the famous and still very funny, at least if you've been through the old-fashioned British education system, 1066 and all that, the satire where it talks about the Roman invasion of Britain and this is all right because the British are natives. It's that idea, well, we're going out, we're civilizing people, and even though it's mocking that concept, there is this sense of progress, that very Victorian idea that you could see represented in so many trains of thought, that we are becoming more sophisticated, we are making the world better, that the forces of imperialism can be, should be, and in the case usually of the country of the person speaking, these are forces of progress, of enlightenment. They are spreading better laws, better medicine, better religious beliefs, better scientific thoughts to a wider and ignorant world. And obviously the technological difference between a country with steamships and Maxim guns to one that was still living in something that's close to an Iron Age society is very dramatic, more so than you would get in the Roman world. So there's less technological difference in this period. It's also, I think it took particular root in the Anglophone world, and it's not just from the British point of view. Obviously, the British were very inclined to see themselves as successors to the Romans and doing the same thing. I think I've mentioned it before, when you read Kipling's Puck of Pook's Hill, and Parnesius, the Roman centurion who goes up in, this is at the very tail end of Roman Britain, could just as easily be a subaltern going off to India, having qualified at Sandhurst, and first of all spending time, he's with, I think, Gallic auxiliaries first. It's like being posted to an Indian army unit before coming back to a British regiment and all this thing, but with a strong sympathy. But essentially you read this, and this is a decent chap trying to do the right thing, even though Kipling does make him a Mithraist, and there are aspects, it's civil war is the background of this, of things that the Romans would do, but somebody in the height of the British Empire shouldn't be doing. So you have that. It's also taken on, interestingly enough, by Hollywood. And in America, while you have more than one view, and there are people who are very opposed to empires, it's interesting that, well, first of all, think of the sort of the 30s and beyond. Hollywood seems to make more films about the British in India than the British do. You've got The Drum, but there's not too much other stuff, whereas you've got Gunga Din, you've got Soldiers 3, you've got Lives of a Bengal Lancer, you've got Weebly Winky with Shirley Temple in even, Laurel and Hardy do, was it Bonnie Scotland, where they end up in a... and you can understand the Hollywood appeal. It's big, it's dramatic, and even if you're actually filming in the California hills and desert areas, and a lot of things look questionably very Indian, you're presenting this as essentially forces of law and order, and you're protecting the ordinary people from bandits, from thugs, from dangerously violent rebels. And that extends into the golden period of the Hollywood epics, where on the whole, the Romans are played by British actors and actresses. And that lasts through. There's that sense really that from the 19th century onwards, and for a lot of people, you could look back at the Roman Empire and essentially it was decent Englishmen in togas. And occasionally there were indecent and cruel Englishmen in togas, but essentially it's that sense of duty, of service, of rather stern Victorian values, which in fact doesn't always work with the Romans, but there's an element, you can see how they could get it, but it's pushed to a degree and it affects their overall presentation. So even though you get cruelty of the Romans in something like Ben-Hur, there are redeeming features. There are other Romans, and you get the better Roman emperors in the robe, Demetrius the Gladiator, as well as the madman, and the decent Romans out there. And a lot of your characters can be Romans who are trying to do the right thing. So you have this emphasis on the great improvement in material culture, and there's, however you look at it, and in spite of various attempts, the period of Roman rule is clearly one of widespread prosperity. It seems to be one of substantial population increase. It is certainly one just about everywhere where the amount of and type of material culture changes, but it's particularly the quantity. It's one of the striking things, particularly somewhere like Britain or in Europe. Pre-Roman periods on a site tend to simply throw up fewer objects, fewer artifacts, and post-Roman ones, the same. But in the Roman Empire, there's just a lot more stuff. And a lot of it has come from a long way away. People are not simply using and wearing clothes, tableware, metalwork that has been made locally within their own community. They have access to things that have come from hundreds, even thousands of miles apart. And you have the development of cities, those great monuments that tourists will still flock to see today. Amphitheatres, theatres, basilicas, arches. These grand Roman buildings, those appear. There is nothing like that, particularly in the West before, and even in the East, there's just more of it in the Roman period. There are more cities with more monuments. It's partly because that's the culture of the empire, but it's also a reflection of the amount of money and effort that was devoted to these things. And we'll come on to this another time. You get in Pliny, when he's governor of Bithynia in the early 2nd century AD, that local communities are competing with each other to who can build the most spectacular gymnasium, this sort of thing, or theatre, or canal, or all of these things. And the projects don't always work out, but it's the sense of civic pride, civic prestige, getting one up on your neighbours within a very Roman context. The rule of law is certainly there. And apart from fundamentally, again, British, they're not Scottish wholly, that Latin law that will be the basis of most European law, and from that spread to other parts of the world as well. This idea, the codification of it will come more later, but nevertheless, it's there from the beginning. The sense of defining very clearly who you are, what your rights are, and how this should be done, how property should be owned, passed on, all sorts of things. Status, that everything is regulated very clearly and on an empire-wide basis. Most of the cities are self-governing. They run their own day-to-day affairs, which is why, as in Pliny's case, you can find them getting into trouble. And they don't go and fight each other. You get riots between Spartans and Athenians in the 2nd century AD and other Greek cities where they start arguing about ancient history, but it's more like the violence of football fans. It's that sort of thing rather than you don't go off and fight a war against each other. You don't go and raid your neighbours, you don't go and behead them, you don't go and steal their cattle in ways that were all too common before the Romans arrive and will return after they go. You have the suppression of the violent religions. So you have the Druidic cult is suppressed in Gaul and in Britain, and with it the headhunting, the human sacrifice, this sort of thing. It's gradual, it takes time, and it isn't something the Romans immediately do when they arrive. It comes in more under Augustus and Tiberius, and then is probably pushed further once they occupy Britain. And maybe there's a political element to that. Maybe you're saying, well, these people are leading the resistance against us, but there seems also to be a distaste for what they're doing. It comes back to when we look at entertainment and things like that. The Romans will happily see people killing each other or being fed to the animals on the basis of entertainment. They just don't really like it on a religious basis. But other than that, they don't really interfere with many religions. Most people go on doing their own thing. Cults survive from before the Roman period, sometimes adapted. And when we come to look in more detail at religion, we'll consider that, because that raises all sorts of questions as to what level of coercion, control is involved. But nevertheless, you can go on worshipping the gods and goddesses that your ancestors have done. You can go on speaking your own language. But if you move into the public field, and the more ambitious you are, you might want to speak Latin, you might want to speak Greek and be part of that wider world. Romanization is a vexed question, and one we'll look at another time. It's not a fashionable word amongst archaeologists, but nevertheless, many aspects of an imperial culture show up everywhere, or nearly everywhere, to varying degrees throughout the Roman Empire. So there is a coming together of ideas, ways of doing things, fashion styles. You can look at the patterns of shoes found at Vindolanda, and they will be matched by ones found in Roman Egypt. and the change seems to occur within a decade or so. Hairstyles, other things like that will be adopted. When Hadrian starts being depicted with a beard, then you see more and more men depicted with beards more generally. It's like Kennedy not wearing a hat and all this sort of thing. They have an influence on this, and there are aspects of culture that spread in a wider way. And when you think of those theatres that are dotted throughout the empire, the plays performed there, the mimes performed there, do seem to have been fairly general everywhere, which raises the interesting idea that, particularly for mimes performed to music, are people humming the same tunes in the north of Britain as they are in Egypt and things like that, at least some of the time. So there's all sorts of aspects of a wider imperial culture. It's important, and much of it is the absorption of Greco-Roman culture, Greek particularly in the East, but also at times in the West as well, Latin in particular in the West. You have education, you have literature, you have access to this culture, and it comes back to that point again. We don't see a lot of traditional culture re-emerging when the Roman Empire does fall in these areas, partly because it's been so long. Britain, one of the last provinces to be added to the empire, is Roman for over 3.5 centuries. It's an incredibly long time. It's very hard for other traditions to be maintained fully in that period. So that was the empire's a good thing. This was a view that was propagated for a very long time, particularly in the first half of the 20th century and before, and then lasted for a while and is still there to some extent because there's some obvious resonance with it, some obvious truth to it. However, there has been a reaction that has really come primarily post-Second World War within the context of the rapid and rather unpleasant and violent collapse of the European empires. And if anything, whilst it's in those former imperial possessions, obviously it's particularly understandable there. You're looking back and thinking, well, we didn't like that very much. We can do better. On the other hand, within the former imperial powers, the academic climate really has been inclined to criticize these things more. It's often because scholars tend more likely to be left than right wing. So you have sometimes the paradox where you could have the Marxist who would tell you that Soviet Russia had been a great idea and wasn't that a wonderful experiment, but that other empires that absorbed lots of other regions were necessarily a bad thing because they didn't have that socialist principle behind them. But there's a tendency with a lot of things like this. When you start thinking that something is a bad thing, you often then want to show that it's not just bad, but it isn't very efficient. It isn't very competent, in the same way that people who thought empires were good things often rather overemphasized how efficient, how effective they were, how long their reach was. You had then, of course, the boom in post-colonial studies, as they've dubbed themselves, which, as always, start with more recent history, but then those ideas are taken on, become fashionable, and archaeologists, ancient historians will employ the same methods of interpretation, but also the same starting assumptions. So instead of beginning with the idea empires are good, civilizing forces, it's all about progress, and that you go into the Dark Ages when the Romans fall because things are worse, you start saying, well, actually, it might be about oppression, conquest, exploitation, all of these things. And of course, this is just natural within academic disciplines. You get these sort of seesawing effect where people change the basic premises, and it's partly to carve out a career for yourself when you feel you can't really add anything to what's already been said, so you just change the nature of the debate altogether. But also it is healthy to ask different questions all the time of your sources. Doesn't mean that every fad is right, because most of them are not, but nevertheless, they all tend to contribute something. There's something where you come and say, okay, I hadn't thought about that, let's consider that. And maybe we need to balance it, because the past isn't going to be simply good or bad. It's going to be very complex, very nuanced, and it will depend a lot on who you are and where you are and when. And the more different types of information, the more different questions we ask, then the more we're likely to learn about the reality that was there. Because that, in the end, what we're getting at. No, not a current ideology, whether a positive one or a negative one, but what was it really like? What was that world like? How did it work? But of course, being an academic discipline, it tends to go too far. And of course, you've had the context that because of the the rise of, as I say, the end of the European empires and the rise of lots of new countries with their own consciousness, they obviously have tended to be particularly hostile to what went before and then to empires in general. So it can be politically orientated, and it's often to go back and say, well, very clearly in that more recent history, look, you can see we've always been a nation that we've become now, and it was hindered by the European powers, which can be true to some extent, but often is far too simplistic and ignores the fact that, as I say, in many cases, the sense of nationhood has been because of a century or more of rule by an outside power that has called the place this thing, and has also made people think, well, we don't want these complete outsiders coming and doing it. Perhaps we can come together and do something better ourselves. So in its extreme form, the post-colonial study quickly goes into the loopy and becomes so politically orientated that everything the empire does is seen from a negative point of view, and then that's not about understanding. You've basically decided before you go and look at the evidence, this is bad, I'm just going to show you how bad it was, rather than, okay, what's there, what is actually going on. So you get a great emphasis on the continuity of culture within areas. This will be extended back to the Roman period. And that's, again, good, and it's worth pointing out, though we have to be careful because, as I say, that culture is not, it doesn't just spring back to life in most places after the Romans go. And aspects of it, yes, people in Britain are still living in roundhouses for a long time into the Roman period, but they don't really do it that much after the Romans have gone. And they've been doing it before the Romans were here for a long time, which is clearly, it's a design that works, people feel comfortable with, functions for the small-scale farming communities that we're dealing with. But you do have, and cities never really take off in all areas of Britain, and in some parts of northern Gaul, to the extent that they do elsewhere. But again, there are big differences. To just emphasize the continuity and ignore the substantial change, the Roman influence, is as misleading as to ignore the continuities and just emphasize the Roman change and the Romanization. There's also great emphasis on resistance, and you get books being churned out all the time claiming that you have to emphasize the people who did resist British rule or French rule or Dutch rule or whatever it might be in more recent centuries, and the same for the Romans, even if they were repeatedly defeated. Because ultimately those places become independent, then this is a sort of thread running through. And you can see that within the nationalist independence traditions, how they draw inspiration from these groups, but it's often deeply misleading, and it tends to pick on examples that suit your case rather than the majority at the time. So you have this, I think in a Second World War context, the emphasis you've had from modern India, not within the military so much, but within the political establishment and wider culture, on the JIFs, the INA, the Indian National Army, formed from prisoners and others taken by the Japanese, that joined the Japanese, took part in the Khmer Imphal campaign and other aspects of the war in Burma later on, as opposed to the Indian Army that was ultimately controlled by the British. So that there's even an Amazon drama series I noticed. I must confess I couldn't face sitting down and watching because it didn't look terribly good, about the JIFs. I don't think I've seen anything equivalent about was it about 2 million volunteers from British India, as it were, that went and fought in the Second World War on the Allied side, and did so with great distinction and courage. It was good to see in the recent VJ commemorations of the 80th anniversary here in Britain that considerable emphasis was placed on the imperial troops that took part. And the fact that they went and they fought, and many felt, as would lead to, certainly it sped up independence elsewhere as well, whether they're troops coming from Africa or whether they're coming from India and beyond. That contribution, if you know anything about military history and you've read about it, you're very aware of this from the start. Popular culture, less so, tends to be handled rather clumsily. But Politically, it's obviously been convenient for successive Indian governments to emphasize the nationalist element, even though there were very few of these people, and they achieved nothing significant militarily. I'm sure some of them were very brave and all this sort of thing, but there weren't very many. The Japanese didn't fully trust them or equip them properly. They were not a major, even a significant factor in deciding those campaigns they were fought, whereas the role of the Indian soldiers fighting under British command was exceptionally important. Without them, that war would not have been won. And it was just through sheer numbers, but also through quality. The 14th Army that went back into Burma, the majority were not British. They were always a minority within this. But again, it depends on, so that's where you're emphasizing one little bit of history because that is important to you and you value. Not that that doesn't exist, not that that shouldn't be mentioned at all, it's just that you've ignored actually the wider picture and the more typical picture because that's important to you. So you will get, you sometimes get emphasis on the pacifist movement in the First World War, and fine, that's interesting, it's well worth looking at, and that's good, but they were a minority, a very small minority. And unless you appreciate that fact and remind yourself of the fact that you're dealing with a minority, you tend to misrepresent the impact of a group. It's like anything that focuses on one particular group. They tend to become more important than perhaps they actually were. And people don't always remember that through this you're seeing one sort of microcosm, one bit of a story that's these individuals, but there are lots of other individuals with their own stories doing perhaps similar, perhaps very different things at the same time. So in the Roman case, a lot of this shift towards the empire as an oppressive, hostile, conquering, exploitative force has become surrounded around the army and its role. And we'll talk particularly about that because that's our theme today. But you've got others. I talk about this a bit in the Pax Romana book. The sense is, oh, well, yes, it's prosperous, but it's the prosperity of farm animals. You could take this extreme view that everyone is basically just there to feed the imperial system. And, they have security, but they have no freedom and all this sort of thing. It's imposing quite narrow modern ideas on what people should like. It's also, as is so often the case, you need to place all of this within the context of what's come before, because very often you find that each empire that goes to an area is actually just taking over from a more localized elite and is doing much the same thing and is often employing some of the same people to actually run things on a day-to-day basis, because it's very hard for a group of outsiders to come in and take over every part of an administration or the running of a thing. You think, again, how little of British India was directly ruled by the Raj at any time. The Roman Empire, more and more of it becomes directly ruled, and eventually the vast majority, but nevertheless there are substantial areas. And this emphasis on local cities having independence in their affairs, that the Romans don't want to get involved, again, we'll come back to this when we look at provincial administration, means that the Romans aren't actually interfering with daily life to any great degree in most of the empire most of the time. But there are other people who are in league with the Romans who might be doing that. And do you perceive those? And are they, in fact, really representatives of the imperial power? Anyway, let's come back to the Roman army. So you have, I've talked in the second video on grand strategy under the emperors, grand strategy of the Principate, about the reaction to Edward Luttwak's book about grand strategy. And one of the leading figures within this, one of the most influential books, is Ben Isaac's The Limits of Empire. A truly excellent book that revolutionized the debate. Whether or not you accept all of his arguments like anybody else's, nevertheless, you have to think very seriously about this. And there's a lot of, he points out a lot of obvious stuff and a lot of flaws in what's come before. So again, important contribution. Other people have taken this on. Isaac broadly argues that the empire isn't defensive, that the Roman emperors are still interested in prestige, glory, that they tend to initiate wars in the east. He's focused very much on the eastern provinces. A lot of evidence from Judea, for reasons we'll come on to in a minute, but also more generally, and arguing that there the Roman army is not deployed to defend against threats from outside, because he argues that most of the time there are not significant threats from outside the empire, but in fact is there to control the civilian population and make sure they do not rebel against Roman rule. Greg Wolfe wrote an article about Roman peace using the term ironically, where he extended this idea to Western provinces and says, well, sometimes, you do have army bases that seem to be in areas we consider to be already conquered, where there's no trace of rebellion, but is there no trace of rebellion because there's a Roman army base there, and people know what would happen if they tried it. So can you extend that idea, and were Roman troops moving around the empire more than we might think, and therefore more of an obvious threat to anyone who was contemplating breaking their allegiance with Rome? So I think there was a big shift then. This was really the 90s, I suppose, in how we were looking at this. People had raised this before, but it became more obvious, and others have extended this, have argued that some of the conquests were unnecessary, with Romans provoke wars. Comes into a lot of the things we've talked about in those debates on grand strategy, and we can't go in today. What we want to think about today is how much basis there is for this idea that the Roman army is there to control the civilian population and ensure that it remains Roman and does not rebel, so that the reason you don't see too many rebellions in much of the empire is because the Romans are good at this, rather than because everybody's decided being Roman is great and they don't want to rebel. Now, a lot of the evidence draws heavily, to some lesser extent, on the Gospels, particularly on the Talmudic literature, the Jewish literature that emerges after the destruction of the temple, really from sort of, on the whole, late 2nd century AD onwards, where you have various rabbis commenting on texts, but also answering questions of what should you do? What is the right thing to do? How should somebody Jewish behave in these circumstances? And some of these make references to bandits, to rebels, and to soldiers. Now, they're usually not specific. There are occasionally ones that very correctly have a rant against the Roman Empire and say how oppressive and exploitative it is. So that's unambiguous. Others where you just talk about soldiers, well, the argument would be, well, whose soldiers would they be other than the Romans, or at least of a sort of client kingdom of the Romans at various times? Romans, or virtually Roman troops. And this tends to, the overall pattern is that the soldiers are depicted as brutal occupiers, and the rebels, the bandits, as Robin Hood figures, heroic freedom fighters, who behave better and who have the sympathy of the wider community. So you have, for instance, rules like this. There's a ruling where a woman, if she's taken captive by soldiers, then the rabbi issuing this particular interpretation says the assumption must be made that she's been raped, whereas if she's been taken by bandits, that assumption would not be the case. The implication being, Isaac saying, well, that shows, the Romans are a lot more brutal because the soldiers must be Romans, and that the bandits, the rebels, are on the fringes of normal society. They're more appreciative of normal society. They obey more of the conventions and respect other civilians. A lot of this, inevitably you get Hobsbawm's social bandit, this idea from a modern historian, but one writing actually in this case largely about literature and folk tales rather than reality, of the perception of these sort of Robin Hood types of figures, that the good guy who's forced into a career of lawlessness, but fights for the, robs from the rich to give to the poor, that sort of thing, or at the very least only attacks the rich and protects the poor. Like a lot of these ideas, it's like Said with Orientalism. These things get applied in a blanket way to ancient history without anybody having to bother to go and read the original. So you get other people will come on and start saying, oh yes, you can basically see a lot of these rebels that appear in this literature. They're basically good types, they're admired. And from this, there is the emphasis on, well, maybe this sort of lawlessness, this sort of banditry is a lot more common than we think. Yes, we have it in the Jewish literature, but maybe it's going on elsewhere. Isaac, for instance, will point out, well, you have all these systems where there are rows and rows of towers alongside roads that could accommodate a garrison of a few soldiers at most. That's not the sort of thing you set up if you're expecting a large enemy army of thousands of men to come and attack. But if you're dealing with something that's bordering on crime, that's smaller scale, keeping a close eye on what's going on who's going along the roads, that may fit, that may suggest that this threat is ever present. It's difficult because we don't know. We have to be a little bit careful in that, in the first place, the Talmudic literature is very hard to date specifically. Often they will cite particular rabbis as the source for a ruling, for an interpretation, and you can sometimes date them, but then you have to assume that it does go back to this person. It isn't simply attached to somebody famous, because that's more likely to give it authority. They are spread over centuries, and there is also the question of how much of this is theoretical and how much of this is about daily life. You could extend, as I say, some of the citing of the gospel, the idea of John the Baptist, when the soldiers come to him and ask, what should we do? And it's, take no more than you're owed, just be content with your pay, don't basically rob people. And there are stories, accusations, charges made in some of the Egyptian papyri of soldiers being involved in crime, robbery, in requisitioning things they're not entitled to and this sort of thing, but other people doing the same as well. We have to be careful, though, as I say. There's first of all that whole dating thing. And if you listen to a news report today, read the papers, there are bound to be lots of violent crimes reported. That is not necessarily the typical experience of all of us, but these things are terrible, are shocking, and therefore draw our attention, rather than, man went to work and nothing happened to him. That's not a story. So is there always a tendency to highlight the unusual? And even more so, the classic thing, think how many movies, how many TV series involve gun battles, violence, often to staggering degrees of body counts. And so many movie posters have actor or actress fondling this sort of glossy firearm. Again, that's not typical of everybody's life. We watch these stories because they're dramatic, because they're unusual, because they're exceptional, not because we say, oh yeah, that's what always happens, I know that. So you have to be quite careful with a lot of these things when they appear, not to, first of all, it's wrong to deny that this sort of stuff might be going on, but then what is the scale? And also, what's the difference between just crime, lawlessness, and anything politically motivated? Just because you might show apparent sympathy to some of the criminals doesn't necessarily mean that you have fellow feeling with them, you think they're on your side, and that it's very much us and them, and they're part of us, because even if on the extreme, on the fringes of us, because they're very much the occupiers, the imperial force that's imposing its will on you. You also have to be rather careful, and if you went to any area today where organised criminal gangs are powerful, let alone paramilitary groupings in areas where there's been issues of terrorism, this sort of thing, you're probably not going to go along the street and find lots of people who are happy to criticise these groups. And it comes down to that basic thing. You can criticise the Romans the same way you can criticise the police. Because they're distant, and that might be right, and they might sometimes be unfair, but that might also be, it's easier to do that. It comes back to the basic thing, and okay, this gets a little bit comic book or melodramatic from a film, but ultimately the bandits, rebels even, whoever they are, paramilitaries, terrorists who are from your society at first and remain on the fringes of it, they know where you live, they know where your children play. They know exactly who you are, and they need to maintain their status. Therefore, you get, in most of these areas, the punishment, beatings, shootings, this sort of thing, to make sure that that particular gang, that particular group maintains its control. So you might well have a reflection, as you would say in the Talmudic stuff, where these are presented quite favorably, but that's because nobody wants to say bad things about them because we know what would happen if you do that. Whereas the organized authorities are a bit more distant, a bit less personal in their retribution. So you can easily criticize them, but also you're hoping that they're going to stop this particular group from getting too out of hand. So it tends to be complex, and there can be all sorts of gradations within that. But as with everything else, we've got to think very carefully before accepting everything as literally true, but then generalizing and extending that to everybody out there at the time. And broadly speaking, we come back to this basic question, is that the evidence simply does not support the idea of large-scale rebellions in most of the Roman Empire for centuries on end. They don't happen. When there are uprisings later on, 3rd, 4th centuries, they're nearly always somebody trying to make themselves emperor, rather than somebody rebelling and wanting to make themselves independent. Very, very rare. The pattern is normally, we've talked about this before in earlier ones, that you get a big rebellion in a province within a generation of conquest. And it seems to be that it needs time for some younger men to grow up who haven't faced the Romans in battle, so are less intimidated by them, but also some of the people to think, well, okay, we knuckled under them, but actually the price of that has been too high, we need to do something about this, as well as the abuses that you get by the Roman authorities. Boudicca's rebellion being a prime example. There's resentment there amongst the Trinovantes, perhaps amongst some of the Iceni and others. There are enough people join this rebellion to say that there are grievances, but also if Boudica had not been so clumsily and violently treated, then this might not have happened, or at least not in the way it did, not on the scale it did. So that comes back to the, if you'll pardon the vulgarity, the bloody fool theory of history, where so often in these situations the worst possible person is in charge and just makes a situation, turns it into a crisis. We don't hear about the situations where somebody able, somebody diplomatic calms things, and you don't end up with a rebellion. So again, that's the way the sources work. So if there aren't rebellions, then either you've got to come down to the idea that, well, the Romans are just very good as an occupying power, or that there's no motive. Now, Roman soldiers are there and about in a lot of the provinces and performing a lot of administrative day-to-day jobs. You get hostility to the soldiers in a lot of the literature, often coming from Rome's elite, that they're vulgar, they're violent, you've got to keep them under tight control and discipline and all this sort of thing, otherwise they get out of hand. But again, how representative that of how other people at lower levels see them. Again, I've done that video about, I think something crude like, were Roman soldiers nice? But it's the idea, how does troops interact with the civilian population? And there aren't simple answers to a lot of this, and it's bound to vary. But they're not separate from. They do seem to mix with the indigenous population. They very often take wives from among that population and raise families, and often settle there. And you can see this from the records from Roman Egypt, that former soldiers will live in the same villages cheek by jowl with civilians, and there doesn't seem to be any sign of friction. It's very hard to tell them apart unless you find other records that give details, and people will go off, join the army, come back. So the idea that the army is always wholly separate from and an oppressive force from the rest of society doesn't work. It's not like that. This comes back to that sense of how strong is this idea of identity, of we are something that we have our association, our sense of belonging that has nothing whatsoever to do with the Romans and predates anything the Romans have brought in. Above the city or the tribe, there are groupings of that seem very powerful, but not beyond that very often. So the aristocracy in the main does pretty well out of Roman rule, and more of it becomes absorbed into the Roman imperial system, so that you have people gaining Roman citizenship, serving as officers in the Roman army, becoming equestrians, going on that equestrian career, and in most cases, most provinces end up sending a few senators to the Senate there, and some quite a few. And people become part of the imperial elite and do very well out of the system, thank you very much. So the aristocracy, the pattern of clearly the Roman way of doing things is to win over the people they consider to be the leaders, the elite, or the people who become that elite. They get to live in villas, they get to live in nice townhouses, they get to go into imperial service, they get status as magistrates, as priests of the imperial cult, all of these things. So they do well as long as they help to control the wider population and keep them. And they're also, you become Roman, but that doesn't mean you've got to give up your own language. That doesn't mean that, when you go out to your country estate, you necessarily live all the time like a Roman, or you decide that sometimes, well, I'm still going to be one of the Iceni or Duratriges or whatever it might be, or a particular group in Gaul or Spain or elsewhere. And obviously, the even bigger you get the emperors who come from provinces as time goes on. So the aristocracy is absorbed, and the aristocracy tend to provide the leaders for many rebellions, Boudica being a prime example. You have the queen, widow of a king, Florus and Sacrovir in the rebellion in Gaul, Civilis is an equestrian, Arminius, the man who leads the successful rebellion in Germany in AD 9, is a Roman equestrian, a member of the royal family of the Cherusci. So there are times like that where people decide, well, this was okay, but actually I think I could do better if we get rid of the Romans, or a strong belief that this is wrong, my people should be independent, whatever it may be, or some mix of those things. The success stories are far more common and far more typical. So an awful lot of people become very Roman and buy into this system and do very well out of it. And to a lower level, we see the top of it, but the people who are living in the smaller townhouses, who get to go to the theatre, who get to go to the bathhouse, and who have that security that they are not being robbed and murdered. At least there is, there's crime, but there are people who are trying to do something about it. Again, go to the papyri in Egypt, where you have people appealing to the centuria regionarius, the regional centurion, army officer on detached duty, supervising an area a bit like a sort of marshal in the Wild West, and asked for, my husband went on a journey, he's disappeared, please help me find him, I was attacked, I've been robbed, please find the culprits, I know, this sort of thing. People felt they could go to the Roman authorities and the Roman authorities would help them. Hints of this from Vindolanda and elsewhere. It's everywhere you go, the authorities are not this hostile force that don't care, or at least they're not perceived as wholly that. It is worth asking them for help. It doesn't mean you're always going to get it, doesn't mean they'll always get it right, and how efficient they are is bound to have varied from place to place, but nevertheless there is this perception that they are not an occupying power. Again, one of the problems we have is the time scale of all of this. I'm fascinated by the Second World War, grew up watching lots of TV films and something, and the whole sort of French resistance and other resistance in Norway, Belgium, Italy, elsewhere. That's a common feature in a lot of stories. And you have that sense of, jackboots pounding along the road, that sense of occupation, swastika flags everywhere. Those occupations will lasted for 4 or 5 years. Longer, Poland, Czechoslovakia, places like that. But not for a lifetime, not for 20 years, certainly not for hundreds of years. I remember there was a documentary by a chap, I can't remember if he'd become an MP at that point, but did later, and now has become a sort of commentator figure, about the areas on the borders between Scotland and England, went to Housesteads and was comparing Housesteads Fort to Camp Bastion and some of the other bases that were then when the war in Afghanistan was ongoing, and sort of presenting the Romans within this fort as very much sensing a hostile environment around them. We're safe behind these walls, but we never know what happens when we go outside. But they're at Housesteads for 300 years. It's not the same thing. You don't tend to keep that level of hostility for so long. It's over time you get more under control, partly because people take you for granted that you're going to be there. You're not the interloper who is fresh, who, you can remember the time before they came, and therefore you can think of a time when they won't be here. So the aristocracy does quite well, and everybody's there a long time. This sort of, some of the models we have of occupation and repression, we have to be careful before extending them to the Romans, because the time period is a big factor. But the question is, were the less well off, were the poorer people far more oppressed. Particularly were they more oppressed under the Romans than they had been before. That's one of the other things, you know, if life hadn't been that great for you beforehand, it may not make quite so much difference, which doesn't mean you won't necessarily resent it. People can often accept, well, it's always been that way. That family has been the landlord, the lord of the manor, the laird, that sort of thing. And therefore, well, I might not like them and I may not think they're fair, but that's just how it is. Whereas these strangers, these foreigners have come in who might also handle things with less sensibility to your culture, and look different to you and sound different to you, that you resent them more. But nevertheless, we should never idealize what's come before. The reasons for rebellion when they do occur clearly vary quite a lot. We've looked at Boudica before. That seems to be, as I say, wider resentment with a particular spark, that Boudica is mistreated, flogged, her daughter's raped. She understandably won't take this, and enough of the noblemen and other people within the tribe feel this is a deep insult to them, a humiliation that must be avenged, and therefore take the great risk of rebellion, which, although it goes well at first, ends up in slaughter and massacre and huge losses that fails, though not the extinction of the tribe or anything like that. But doesn't mean the Romans weren't savage, and the impression is that Suetonius is withdrawn because he's too savage in his reprisals. Other rebellions, there's clearly resentment in Germany, but remember, if you think back to Arminius, his brother stays loyal to the Romans. So it isn't always simple. That comes back to, as I say, think to examples like the American Revolution, where the range of opinion is quite varied and where, in many respects, the causes then will divide families and communities far more than the Civil War that tended to be more on state lines. Not entirely, but there are more divisions within communities because it is something, a radical change, but it also succeeds because enough people believe that this is the right thing to do and are willing to keep going, join the Continental Army, do this sort of thing. Even if they're not the majority, they are a significant body within the wider population that may have different reasons for doing this, but it comes together. It's just to remind ourselves things can be complicated. And so, rebellions are very, very rare. The one exception to this, and even this may be less of an exception than we think, but the one place where you don't just have this pattern of a big rebellion within a generation of conquest and then pretty much stability and very little sense of politically motivated resistance that is aiming at independence, is in Judea, but also the wider Jewish population within the empire. So we're going to look particularly first at the rebellion that began under Nero in 66, lasted through to 73-ish. We talked about it very briefly in the earlier lecture, but let's just look at this particularly, and then from that we'll broaden out to other Jewish rebellions and try and see what's going on and what does this tell us about what's happening elsewhere as well as what's going on here. The cause, though, very clearly within this is an extremely strong sense of identity. The rebels in this rebellion, but also elsewhere, knew themselves to be Jewish, as different from the Gentile population with all its variations. And that sense of Jewish identity long predated any Greco-Roman influence. This is not so widely true of the Eastern Empire. Bear in mind, go back to the 4th century BC, Alexander the Great has swept through the Persian Empire and settled lots of colonies, established Greek cities, all of this sort of thing. The Hellenic influence has become very strong on large parts of the world, but many of those communities within the Persian Empire, the Babylonians and others, had an earlier culture, an earlier sense of identity. But a lot of the East, it's many communities. There are certain distinct ones that have been big and powerful for a long time. A lot of them have belonged to successive empires and have got along more or less well within those empires and have come to see their own identity in relation to others more easily. And in some cases, they are cities, they are areas that have been organized by those empires rather than spontaneously growing up beforehand. That's particularly obviously with all the city foundations that you get from Alexander and then the successors. The Jewish community has a much stronger sense of something that, as far as they are concerned, goes back to a much more distant past that has nothing to do with the Persians or with Alexander, even though there will be quite positive memories of some of these earlier empires, obviously particularly the Persians allowing the restoration of the temple and this sort of thing. So they have a strong sense of identity that is reminded for everybody. The reminder is in their day-to-day life, not just the formal rituals of what you can do, what's right, what the law says you should do, what you shouldn't. You have the temple in Jerusalem as the center, you have sacrifice, you have this strong perception of yourself that you know you are Jewish, and you know you are Jewish because of ancestry, but also this is the way I behave. These are the rules I follow. The Romans initially, when they take over Judea, that before this had been part of the Seleucid Empire, then had broken off under the Maccabees to create the Hasmonean kingdom, which has extended beyond some of the areas that the Seleucids considered to be Jewish, has included Idumea, Galilee, regions like this, has at times also brought Gentile communities under its control, because these are often they're existing, they've established already. It's a patchwork in many cases. And you've got Samaritans and people like that as well. So you have had over a century of strong, independent rule by a Jewish royal family that has also bickered with itself. And when the Romans become involved under Pompey and others, it's because of power struggles within that leadership. But essentially the Romans begin from Pompey onwards by trying to find their own candidate and ally from within that group who will be friendly to them and do what they want. They don't want direct rule. Again, it's this pattern, you can do your own affairs and just get on with it. But don't do anything we don't like, don't do anything against us. And then that moves on, you get the Herods. Herod the Great being obviously the longest and most important, who transitions through Caesar to Antony to Augustus, manages to make himself acceptable to the winning side in a succession of Roman civil wars. And again, we tend to remember the older Herod, the one who's paranoid, murdering his own family, cruel, vicious, suspicious. The Augustus joke that I'd rather be Herod's pig than his son. You forget the more dynamic leader you'd had in the early days, where he at times even is put in command of Roman troops, which is quite interesting, and fights with great skill and courage and initiative. But he is still the best recorded, the most dramatic figure within the dynasty he founds, with the few survivors that are left to go on to rule parts of his kingdom. That's generally the Roman approach at first, is get a king that, as far as the Romans are concerned, is Jewish. As far as many Jewish people will be concerned, is really an Idumean, is not fully Jewish, is a foreigner. And of course we don't like him because he's damn dangerous. But nevertheless, it works reasonably well. The area prospers. There is friction, there is violence, there is opposition. But over time that breaks down, and you end up with the prefects being imposed as Roman governors and direct rule. So you get this pattern in the first century, the early decades of it, where sometimes a region is under direct rule of a Roman prefect. Later the title becomes procurator, people like Pontius Pilate. And at other times it's under the rule of an allied king, usually one of the Herods. Always one of the Herods. And there's a lot of prosperity in this period. You can see that from the sheer scale of the building projects of Herod the Great. You can think of the great artificial harbour at Caesarea. Obviously, Jerusalem itself grows ever more magnificent, the temple in particular being the centerpiece, but also royal palaces, the big towers he built. Herod was a great builder. That's an emphasis on the power of a monarch, but it's also, remember, all of these projects provide work for people. and there's profit from it for supplying them as well. So and in the same way, the port at Caesarea, creating an artificial harbour on a coast where there's no natural harbours, means that more and more trade will come through your kingdom, and therefore you can levy tolls on it. So there's a lot that's done to make at least some people more prosperous, that continues under the Roman rule. But though you have, there's one of the problems that Pontius Pilate has, one of the moments of friction, is that he wants to use temple funds to build an aqueduct to help supply water to Judea. It's what a Roman governor would be encouraged to do in any other province, but because here it's sensitive, these are sacred, you can't just take this for this project, it becomes an issue. Another one, when he comes up to Jerusalem, he spends about a month there around about Passover time, with an escort who bring the standards and put them into the fortress of Antonia, where these troops are billeted. Fortress of Antonia is a tower joined on to the temple. Probably not, as you see in this model, a large sort of fort in its own with turrets on each corner, but one big tower. So a bit smaller than that. That's what the excavation has shown more recently, since after this was made. And then there is a protest that these standards perhaps themselves are graven images. Perhaps they also had the imagenes, the images of the emperor that Roman army units kept with their standards. And there's protests about this. This is, an insult. It's and Pilate backs down. So you get, as you do get under Herod, there is opposition, there is friction. Sometimes this turns into violence, sometimes this turns into banditry. At the death of Herod, you have the intervention by Varus, the chap who's going to march to disaster in AD 9 and have his 3 legions wiped out by Arminius. He marches twice into Judea to restore order in the confusion as, well, Herod's gone, what's going to happen now? Different groups claiming power, different groups asserting themselves. You have another governor of Syria marches in with an army in AD 6, in the time of the census, when there's opposition to that. So there is opposition to the rule of the Herods and the allied kings. There is opposition to Roman direct rule, not from everybody, and differing in type. Some of this is formally raised through natural ways. Some of it is peaceful protest. Some of this is violence. And the responses vary in each case and are not always logical. Eventually the Romans decide that Judea itself just can't be handled by the Herods. One of the Herods ends up living out his life in France, at Lugdunum, Lyon, because he's given comfortable retirement, but you don't trust him to run things. And there are changes, there are differences in the attitudes of Claudius Caligula, people like this. So instead of a single ruler, the Romans rely more, as they do elsewhere, on the local aristocracy, which in the main means the high priestly families, Jerusalem-based. You can again see from some of the archaeology, some of the Second Temple period, they've got these very big aristocratic houses, and they are properly laid out, and they have the mikvahs, the ritual baths, and all of this sort of thing. Very Jewish, very consciously Jewish, but also very wealthy. And these are the groups that you see in Josephus, these are the groups that you see in the Gospels. The people who will provide the high priest, but also the Sanhedrin, the council, the advisors. And as the Romans do in other provinces, they rather rely on these people to keep the rest of the population in some sort of order and not doing anything the Romans don't want, and as a result give honour and reward to this particular group. The city becomes exceptionally wealthy, and you can see this in the scale of what the temple was. There's near the Armenian church, there's a marble column that was being carved out of the quarried almost on the spot to go into the temple, but gets cracked before it can come out. And it's one of those rare things where they're really showing off. They're trying to make it as a one-piece column rather than as drums that you'd render over the top in the more normal way. That's cheaper and easier and less risky, but isn't quite showing off in the same way. You get pilgrims coming to Jerusalem, obviously from the wider Jewish community, and that includes Jews from within the Roman Empire, from Egypt, from Cyprus, from elsewhere, but also Jews from the Parthian Empire will come and will make their offerings at the temple and come as an armed convoy. And it's interesting, it's one of the many things I've talked about elsewhere and will no doubt do again, where armed groups will go between the Roman and the Parthian Empire without either empire being bothered. You're there to protect the money you're carrying and the people. So Jerusalem itself grows as a city. It becomes a very wealthy city, and a lot of it has to do with the temple cult. But you also get, I mean, again, one of the inscriptions that survives defines from the temple cult where you could go depending on who you are. So Gentiles could only go so far, women could only go so far, in the same way that ultimately you've got the Holy of Holies in the center of the temple where only the priests can go after certain preparations, under certain circumstances. It is a place that is considered holy, is considered spectacular, clearly attracts visitors, pilgrims, if you will, from people who are just wondering, well, you know, what's this Jewish belief like? Let's go and consider that. But the problem is, although you have an aristocracy that's actually doing quite well, you know, the people who are going to profit most from this are going to be the high priestly families. They're doing very well out of this. They can't really join the Roman system. Now, if you look at earlier empires, from Egyptians, Persians, others, many of them recruited Jewish troops and used them in their army as ethnically based. You can call them mercenaries, you can call them allies, whatever they were. You know, you have those settlements where people are put down on the Nile under the Egyptians and remain culturally distinctively, and as far as they are concerned, fully Jewish, but they're in the service of a foreign king, a foreign empire. The Romans don't manage to do that, and it seems to be a two-way thing in that the Romans recruit pretty much everybody else into the army. The problem is that service in the Roman army, as the Roman army has emerged by this time, and it's probably not true of these earlier empires, requires taking an oath to the emperor. It requires taking part in sacrifices that are done at a unit level. You can see the famous painting from Juria Europus of the standards as the tribune of the cohort is sacrificing. You have the amarganates, you have these graven images with. So on the one hand, there's a lot that's problematic from the point of view that if you want to be a practicing Jew, you can't really do. You have Tiberius Alexander, who comes from the Jewish community in Egypt and embarks upon an equestrian career, becomes eventually the procurator of Judea. But he's largely done that by not living as a Jew, at least as far as we can tell. He may well still consider himself to be Jewish, and the Romans use him for advice about, well, you know, what do the Jews think about this? How do they act? Things they don't understand. But as far as many other Jews would be concerned, he would not count. There does seem to be a particular trend, and it may well have something to do with the Maccabees and the resistance that had freed the Jewish kingdom from rule by Hellenistic power, that the emphasis very much in this Second Temple period is on quite rigid adherence to the rules. And of course you get this particularly, one of the things we'll talk about in a minute is the division within of the sects, the philosophies, as Josephus calls them, Sadducees and Pharisees that we're familiar with from the New Testament, the Essenes that don't openly feature there. Josephus emphasizes the third philosophy, and then you have this question over, is there a fourth, more independence-minded, more rebellious, more nationalistic philosophy. But if you think of the ritual baths, if you think of the emphasis, if you think of the stories in the gospel, you know, where it's about what should you do in these circumstances, you know, disciples gathering grain rather, on the Sabbath, how far should you travel on the Sabbath, what should you do, how should you behave? Very strict sense of to be pure, to please God, to live a proper life, what should I do? What are these rules? So maybe there's an extra strictness. The aristocracy is predominantly Sadducees or Pharisees, as far as we can see. Again, some of these divisions may be less clear at the time. But you can't really buy into the Roman system. You can't just become an equestrian and go off and have a career, because it would require you to do things that you can't do, you feel you cannot do. So unlike elsewhere, there is no aristocratic movement in any significant thing. You know, people like Tiberius and Alexander are very rare. You've also got another problem, is that the Romans expect the aristocracy, the wealthy, whoever they are in a particular community, to be able to control everybody else, to be listened to be obeyed. But Jewish society doesn't really work that way. Yes, they're important. Yes, they are significant. But other people can be significant too, because so much depends on how you interpret the Torah, how you interpret essentially the law, how you should live as a Jew. So hence you get a John the Baptist, and other figures appear in Josephus and elsewhere. These people who are not from the elite, who are not from the priestly families, say the same with Jesus, leaders that appear and gather followers, and who are respected for their interpretation of God's purpose, God's plan, how we should live as Jews, that don't come from this. So people will listen to others because they consider them to be wise, to be holy. And it's very hard to control that. And that's, the political background of the arrests of John the Baptist, Jesus, and other figures who appear in Josephus and elsewhere at this time. So it isn't easy for the high priestly class. They cannot rigidly control the rest of the Jewish nation. And there is a tradition of, it's not quite democracy in the Greek sense, but very definitely people expressing their opinions as Jews coming together. And at the festivals in particular, because again, you've got this on an annual basis, more than once, people will gather and they remember aspects of the history. Passover, obviously the escape from Egypt, Hanukkah. Again, you'll get all these things where you're looking back to resistance against the Seleucids. So you have the way it's presented. Maybe sometime we'll look at the gospel accounts, what they tell us about Roman administration, how this is presented. But regardless of arguing about the details of particular events, the way these are presented is of a governor who has to interact with the lobby groups of powerful individuals, high priests, Sanhedrin, this sort of thing, but also crowds that appear. And whether it's the crowd that is presented as welcoming Jesus in Jerusalem beforehand when he rides in and cheering him then, whether it's the crowd calling out for his execution, this reaction. Now you get this in lots of other societies, but it is particularly marked in Jewish society, and the aristocracy seems to have to listen as much as they tell in ways that was perhaps less true elsewhere. You've also got the sense of a high priestly class that is very jealous of its power because it knows how precarious its position is, apart from all the inevitable competition within that class for preeminence. Particular families do seem to dominate, and individuals do. So they are more concerned with that and also keeping in with the governor. And again, you've got that problem that every few years another Roman governor arrives. So you've got to make sure you get in with him. And some of them have extremely difficult personalities, and none of them to any great extent, possible exception of Felix, but he doesn't get a very good press and doesn't seem to come out of this well, but is married to Berenike, one of the Herods. Most Romans do not understand Jewish culture. If you want to get an idea of this, read the introductory section in Tacitus' Histories, where he's building up to his mostly fragmentary account of the Jewish rebellion, where he talks about Moses meeting Jupiter Ammon in the desert in Egypt and all this sort of thing. And it's a garbled version of somebody not really paying much attention to material that was probably available. It's the sort of thing anyone would say about a country or a culture or a group that they don't really know very much about, and don't really care to find out. But the Jewish sense of identity, Jewish practices are very different, and the fact that they're monotheists is incredibly rare in the ancient world and seen as a rejection of the other gods and goddesses. It's almost the closest that Romans and Greeks can see to atheism, in the sense that you're denying all our gods, you're just saying you've got yours. It's difficult, and particularly at this period where the rules for being Jewish are being hotly disputed within the Jewish community itself and breaking into several groups, but also tend to be quite rigid, perhaps more so than they have been at other times. Trying to navigate all of this is an extremely difficult thing for someone to do who's come in with no real background and knowledge of this, and is therefore going to rely on local advisors or be dependent on them, but then who is going to be the local advisor? So everything is fluid, everything is rather unstable, and that probably contributes to the pattern of bandits appear, leaders appear, they do things, they get suppressed by a Roman governor violently, there are protests, there are difficulties, some of these are dealt with peacefully, some of these are dealt with violently. I've already talked about the protests when Caligula wanted his image put up in the temple at Jerusalem, where it's done peacefully and where, to his great credit, the governor of Syria refuses to obey the order and, at the risk of his own life, writes back to Rome and says, look, we shouldn't be doing this, this is a bad idea, these people are not causing any trouble, they're not disloyal to Rome, it's just this really violates their basic principles. Again, items like that, incidents like that, need to be remembered alongside the moments of brutality. Because we hear about the spectacular ones where there was a risk to the man, we don't really hear about the ones that were handled rather more calmly. But nevertheless, there are difficulties. When you get riots, when you get problems, this is the Roman army. It doesn't have water cannon, it doesn't have tear gas, it doesn't have non-lethal ways of dealing with this. So you've either got to let the riot happen, or you let the soldiers loose, possibly with clubs rather than with edged weapons, but nevertheless, it's going to be pretty brutal. But then what else do you do? It's all very well talking about massacres in history, but the alternative isn't always as pretty as we might like to think. Particularly, and the judgments made by nervous people under stress when they see this and think this could turn into a widespread massacre, so I need to stop it now. Yes, that'll all be dismissed by those who feel that way, as this isn't I'm just an apologist for empires and massacre and all that. Just try and understand is the main thing. It's not simple. It's always much easier to judge these things from a distance when we're not involved. And the making snap decisions, people sometimes get it wrong. Sometimes they do it because they're brutal and they want to oppress and all that sort of thing. I'm not denying that at all. But it is quite difficult. This is a very difficult region to control for anybody. It has been for the Herods, it has been for the high priests, it is for the Roman governors. So, and there are problems of crime and banditry. The assumptions you get within the literature of the period. So, the story of the Good Samaritan. The idea that somebody could get beaten up on a journey and that good people walk past because they don't want to get involved because this is a bit too dangerous. Josephus notes, he talks about the Essenes, this rather closed sect that are probably associated, I think almost certainly, with the Qumran community and the literature we get from that. Josephus mentions that they only carried weapons when they were travelling. Gives you an idea of how dangerous travel could be. So, within the, again, gospel accounts, you've got the disciples that are nicknamed the Sons of Thunder. You've got Judas Iscariot, Sicarius, same people who end up in Masada. That revolutionary element, there are clearly lots of revolutionary ideas and people who think we've got to change, we've got to get things right, we've got to be pure, we've got to throw out the foreigners, this imperial power, but we've also got to oppose the high priest maybe, or the Herods, because they are either just wrong in their own right or they are pawns of the imperial power. It's very, very complicated. Generally speaking, neither the Roman authorities nor the high priest do much to deal with what seem to be fairly widespread economic problems affecting the poor in particular. Think how much debt is emphasized in the New Testament, and that sense of it's pretty precarious having your small farm and keeping going, and you might well be in debt to somebody else. And how do you deal with that? You're a tenant farmer. These are the sort of figures that come into the parables. It's this sense of that sort of world. And there are other hints that there are serious problems. And that you have the absentee landlord, again, a figure in the parables. Josephus presents most of the Roman procurators as bad at their job, as oppressive, as cruel, particularly from Pilate onwards. Again, we should be careful. Much of this is, not necessarily their fault. You've got the difficulties of understanding, but also this is just such a volatile area. Nobody is handling this area very well from the Herods onwards. And bear in mind that before Herod gets to power, you've had civil wars and power struggles within the communities and opposition to them. And again, read Josephus' Antiquities and the shorter version in the Jewish War of the outbreaks of violence, the bandits that appear, that before the Romans get there, a lot of these problems are about. Now, you get several sporadic outbursts of resistance, rebellion, Again, maybe we'll do all this in more detail at some point, because it is fascinating. And in a wider sense, you've got Chris Mason's book on the Jewish revolt that's very thorough. Obviously read Josephus. And I think Barry Strauss, I've just heard, has got a new book coming out on the Jews under Rome. Well worth a look. Martin Goodman's book about Rome and Jerusalem. I'll put all these in the notes section at the bottom. There's a lot out there to read, but I always recommend going back to Josephus. It's well worth it. So you have sporadic outbreaks and violence, and they're there in the New Testament. They're particularly there in Josephus. You have the less days. The bandits are a big feature of Josephus' account. Some of them do seem to be just that. People who are robbing to support themselves, the band of men. Some of them do seem to be far more politically, religiously motivated. And there's probably a lot of grounds in between those two extremes. And that's the impression you get as well from the New Testament, in the sense of where Paul is mistaken for another rebel that's been violently suppressed by the Romans. And hints elsewhere of these other things. And Josephus talks about more of them. And there are problems amongst the Samaritans as well. You get violence there too. You get intercommunal violence with Jewish and Gentile communities dotted around Judea, Galilee, these areas, but also Caesarea, which is a pagan city but has a substantial Jewish population. You get them in Alexandria in particular, in Egypt or near Egypt. Tension that builds up to violence, provocation. At Caesarea, one of the incidents involves a group of sort of local rowdies, basically young noblemen and their followers, eager to show off, eager to impress themselves, who conduct a mock sacrifice as people are going into the synagogue on the Sabbath. Other friction where the synagogue wants to expand, but the Gentile who owns the land they want to buy won't sell. Some of these are little things and petty things that are just human beings being human beings, and the friction that's created with the added sort of motivational tendency to catalyst almost, that you have these distinct groups, that the Jews are distinct, everybody knows who they are, they know who they are, and they are suspicious at the very least of Gentile communities, and maybe more than one Gentile community who are in turn back at them. These tensions that go on. One striking thing is that under the Julio-Claudians, really until comparatively late in Nero's reign, when Jewish communities go to Rome to complain about issues like this, the Roman authorities nearly always favour them and decide that they're right, or decide that they're the ones that are worth placating. Nero's wife Poppaea was seen as particularly sympathetic to the Jewish community. But later on, in the build-up to the war itself, Nero reverses this trend and rules against the Jews. So the combination of governors who seemed to be hostile, who didn't get along well with the high priests, everybody's sort of walking a tightrope, trying to please different pressure groups, different people above them, below them, and it doesn't always work. You add in the fact that some of the governors do seem to be on the take, more than is usual. And of course, the Jewish communities do seem quite organised. Josephus mentions going to Rome as part of a delegation to raise issues. You have the story of Philo from Alexandria who goes to see Caligula. You've also got the governor of Syria. So you've got somebody far more powerful, a senator of a big military province, who has at least a degree of moral, if not literal, authority over the procurator of Judea itself, somebody else where you can go and complain. And these intervene on a few occasions. So the whole thing is never really that stable. It culminates in the major uprising in 66, which begins in Jerusalem. And the causes are these little points of friction and bad decisions by Florus, the governor, who does seem to make things worse. It's a little bit like Decianus Catus in provoking Boudicca's rebellion. You've got somebody, it's the wrong man in the wrong place at the wrong time. With that the shock that suddenly the Romans aren't favouring them as they have before, or seeing the truth, if you look at it that way. Because what's interesting is that a significant part of the high priestly class joins the rebels in 66. Rather than all siding with the Romans and the authorities, people decide, actually, no, we can't trust the Romans to be properly Jewish. We've got to try and go our own way. We've got to oppose Rome. We've got to throw off Roman rule. Josephus is an example of this. He comes from one of these families. Probably a lot of the ones who do join the rebellion are younger men, like him, but nevertheless, there isn't this. Then you have the factionalism within the rebel groups, because this is not an organized single resistance movement. These are lots of people who have become dissatisfied with Roman rule, some over the long term, some more recently, and they have different interpretations of what sort of state they want. It's a bit like, I mean, again, you've got the different factions within, say, the French resistance, the Gaullists and the communists and others, that didn't necessarily get on terribly well. In the Jewish case, it's extreme. I mean, it's the old cliche of, two Israelis is three opinions. The pattern that Josephus, who is the main narrator of this, emphasizes again and again is the way where the different rebel leaders and groups turn on each other. So a lot of the high priests get massacred early on. There's a lot of violence between the partisans of different communities. And you have the impression throughout is that you get highly committed warriors, soldiers, followers, partisans of particular leaders and particular groups that are numbered in the hundreds, perhaps thousands, and then wider sections of the communities will join them to fight at different times. Florus runs away. The Roman garrison in the fortress of Antonia left in Jerusalem is besieged, persuaded to surrender, massacred, apart from one of its officers who declares that he's going to become Jewish and is spared for that reason. But there'd been the initial pattern. The initial pattern is exactly the same as Boudicca's rebellion, and as far as we can see, typical of the Roman military response to rebellion. Because the first response, when trouble breaks out, when rioting breaks out, Florus gathers more of the auxiliary garrison of the province, goes to Jerusalem, confronts the rebels, gets beaten, and that's when he retreats. And then the rebels win another victory when they take over the city itself and get disposed of the garrison. It then takes time for news to reach the governor of Syria, a chap called Cestius Gallus. He gathers a field army from all that's readily available. Now, he's got about 4 legions at his disposal, plus a lot of auxiliaries. Only one, 12th Fulminata, goes on campaign in anything like full strength, and you have detachments of the others, you have auxiliary units, and you have an awful lot of allies. Now, one thing that's happened as the rebellion has broken out is that you've had intercommunal violence in many, but not all, of the cities throughout the wider region, in Alexandria, in Caesarea. But oddly enough, it's not everywhere. And some communities massacre their Jewish population, some don't. And you get the oddity where at Bet Shean, most of the remains are from later on, but nevertheless they're very impressive. It's one of those sites in Galilee well worth visiting. It's one of the 10 towns, the Decapolis from the New Testament. There, the Jewish population of the city fight alongside their Gentile neighbours against a raiding band of one of the Jewish partisan groups. However, they're then subsequently massacred by the Gentiles who decide they can't trust them anymore. But elsewhere, there doesn't seem to be any obvious pattern. There are some areas where people are arrested. There are some areas where the Jewish community is not touched at all. And that presumably tells us more about what relations have been like beforehand that we just don't have detail about, and who's in charge on the spot, whether hysteria and hostility takes over, or whether people can calm things down and be more pragmatic. And there are some Jewish communities. Sepphoris, the big city, will surrender to Cestius Gallus as soon as he arrives. Not everybody fights. However, the Cestius Gallus organises his army. He then marches, and it's a scraped together force. It's not a field army prepared for a long campaign, and many of these troops will have come out of other duties. They're not necessarily prepared for war, because it's all caught the Romans by surprise. But the idea is march down, put on a display of force, knock some heads together, probably execute people, and then the rest will just give in, because it will emphasise that the Romans have no doubt they're going to win, and therefore you might as well quit at this stage. There's no point fighting us. We are bound to win. So why suffer? Why die? Give in and we'll be nice to you. And he marches down to Jerusalem eventually. As I say, places like Sepphoris will surrender to him en route. Other communities will submit. Elsewhere, there are executions. It's very similar in pattern to Varus's interventions around the time of the death of Herod the Great, Quirinius in AD 6. As he marches towards Jerusalem, he is confronted by a rebel force near Gaboa. You see this little village here today, and beats them, but whilst he's fighting, some rebel groups get behind him and attack his baggage train. And again, this is probably an army that's not terribly well supplied in the first place, but once you start to lose some of what you've got, it makes everything more precarious. Gallus continues. He's a bit surprised. They've got this whole obsession of the Jews aren't going to fight on the Sabbath, so we're all right on that day. And the rebels ignore this and surprise them. It's something Josephus brings out when he's talking about Jewish groups in Parthian Empire as well. How often people are mistaken by this. Cestius Gallus begins an assault on Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a very strongly walled city. He makes some progress, but not enough. The rebels stand firm. They don't just quit at this display of force. That's really the gamble the Romans have made, that turning up with this big army will make people think, no, it's far too dangerous, we've got to give in. They don't do that. They stand and fight and resist, and Gallus is not prepared for a long siege. He's probably been affected as well. If he's lost a lot of his supplies during the earlier engagement, then things are particularly bad. So he's even less prepared than he was to start off with. So once he realizes that the rebels are not going to give in, he orders a retreat. The retreat partly follows the Bet Horon Pass, which you can see today. It's a very narrow defile, really, part of its stretch. Very rugged, difficult area. The rebels, again, retreating from anybody who's angry with you is always a dangerous thing to do, in close contact with the enemy. The rebels are inspired, they attack with great enthusiasm. In the course of this campaign, the Romans lose 5,000 men plus. Suetonius tells us that the eagle of 12th Fulminata is also lost, which Josephus doesn't mention, which would be quite odd, because he talks about standards being captured elsewhere. So I think it might be that actually it was literally lost, that it's buried under the corpses, or the rebels don't see its significance, whatever it might be. But it's a humiliation for 12th Fulminata in particular. That's the main force. You know, they leave a rear guard, that gets cut to pieces. Gallus will die of despair disease in the aftermath of this. So he may not have been a healthy man in the first place, or he may have been broken by this experience. But instead of the Romans putting on a display of force and overawing the rebels, crushing the rebellion right when it started, they get the worst possible result. The Romans have been humiliated. The rebels have got a spectacular, miraculous victory, which is more than enough to inspire far more people to join them and for them to be more and more confident. They will send people out, people like Josephus, he gets sent as a commander up to Galilee, others elsewhere. While they're still bickering, there's an attempt. This is when the rebels start minting their own coins. And for a few years, there is an independent Jewish state based around Jerusalem. So the rebellion has been remarkably successful, but the problem is you're still dealing with the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is big. Judea is enclosed on all sides by other Roman territory, whether allied or directly ruled. So it's not something you can easily say, unlike Germany beyond the Rhine, that you can just give up. That's clearly the hope, but it's not how things work out. It's also particularly damaging for Nero. This is late in his reign when he's getting less and less popular, so defeat is a bad thing. This is when he chooses Vespasian to go out and take command of an army for Judea. This is separate from, there's another man who's governing Syria, Mucianus. And Vespasian does the job properly. He gathers a much stronger army, organizes his supply. At first, the army is based around 3 legions. Later, there'll be troops brought up from Alexandria as well. Titus, his son, serves under him. The father of the Emperor Emperor Trajan serves under him as one of his legionary legati. And instead of going bullheaded at the heart of the rebellion, going straight for Jerusalem, they do things systematically. Basically, they begin in Galilee and they start taking one stronghold after another. Siege after siege. Now, there is always an attempt to make people surrender first. Negotiation goes right the way through and it continues to the siege of Jerusalem. You have the dramatic account of Jotapata, where Josephus is the commander. Again, read his vitae, his life, for a slightly less dramatic account of his early operations in Galilee, where sometimes he's involved in skirmishes with just a few dozen people. It's quite rare to get that level of detail, so it's well worth a look if you don't know. It's only a few short sections, but it's well worth a look. Josephus presents himself as a great commander up against the mighty Roman army. Obviously he exaggerates, but broadly speaking, the archaeology fits pretty well with his description. Jotapata is not a big place, but that's true of lots of the towns that are called cities within Judea. But it does have walls, it is fortified, and there's no reason to believe the siege did not take the month and a bit that Josephus claims. And that they did repulse some of the assaults. It's, broadly speaking, the fascinating thing about this is that here we have an eyewitness account of somebody fighting against the Roman army. So when he talks about how terrifying it was when the Romans, after being silent just before their attack, blared out with their trumpets and raised their battle cry, he says he told his men to cover their ears so they wouldn't be frightened by it. But it's little details like that. It's that sense of what it's like to face them. It's unique. We don't get that anywhere else in this sort of detail. It's also, the Jewish war is the most detailed account of the Roman army of the empire on campaign until you get to Ammianus. It's the level of detail is similar to Caesar, though the style is different, and the commentaries. Unfortunately, this is not a war of big battles and pitched battles in the open, so we don't get that. It's mostly about sieges, but it tells us a lot about sieges. Eventually, the Romans get in. Josephus and a small group of sort of close associates are hiding in a cave, and this is where he tells the story that they all agree to commit suicide, draw lots for who will be the last two, who'll kill all the others, and then they'll deal with each other. He and another chap win the lottery, supposedly by divine intervention or chance, whatever. You do have to wonder, the cynic does suggest is there an element of sleight of hand in this. They kill the others, then the two of them sit down and said, "Do you want to do this? Nah, let's just surrender." He surrenders, he grovels before Vespasian, prophesies that he's going to become emperor, all this sort of thing, claims again divine inspiration, and subsequently, when all this happens, is pardoned and favoured and ends up in Rome, a Roman citizen. Flavius Josephus, who writes these books to explain the rebellion, partly to advise his countrymen not to do it again, but also to stand up for the status and dignity of Jewish culture, Jewish religion. In the Antiquities in particular is very much about that. Say, look, we're ancient, we haven't just made this up, there are reasons why we do everything, and they're good reasons. Later on, you get the Siege of Gamala. Here's some pictures of this. This is up on the Golan Heights. It's another of the... and that's the interesting thing, is because it was abandoned after the siege, and because it's the Golan Heights, a disputed area, it hasn't been built over. So the excavations there, they go a little bit too far, and they have plaques with quotes from Josephus' account of the siege put next to various things, but nevertheless, broadly speaking, it's the same. Josephus talks about 3 breaches in the wall. The archaeologists only found 1 so far. So there are some differences, but he talks about undermining a tower. We seem to be able to see the tower. We certainly get the impression of the very narrow streets. It's on a spur of land. It's very hard to reach. The Romans have to build ramps to get up to it and then batter their way through the wall. There's an initial assault which gets into the town, but as the Romans get amongst the streets, they can't see where they're going. And it does look as if the streets between the houses here are just about wide enough for a donkey carrying panniers either side, but no wider than that. So it's very hard to know where you are, see what's going on. The rebels rally, chase them out. Vespasian himself gets caught up in this, gets wounded in the foot, but eventually they fight their way out. And then there's a second assault where they go in, there's a mass suicide of many of the defenders, and the place is taken. There's an argument as to whether the synagogue here or the one in Masada is the oldest surviving. It would be nice sometime if they did more work there, but because there's quite a lot of the town has not been uncovered, but again, these things are very expensive. It's a lovely place to visit. It's well worth it, but in my typical Mad Dogs and Englishmen, doing it in noon in the summer might not always be the best idea, particularly as it's the nesting place of vulture eagles.
Now they are eagles rather than vultures, but nevertheless they look like that. So it turns into every sort of Foreign Legion film, Lost in the Desert film, when you're wandering around there. There's these things circling over your head, actually hunting the rock rabbits up there. But nevertheless, it's a bit, but as I've always found visiting any site, when the archaeology is great, you don't notice the heat of the environment so much and you just go on. However, I take some pride in when, with the friend I was there with, we were the only two people on site, we got back up, as I say, this is noon, in the height of summer, to the car park, and the people who are in the kiosk there called us over and said, "Excuse me, but are you English?" I felt rather proud about that nobody else would be thought of as so stupid as to have gone down there at this time of day. Anyway, that's an aside. Galilee is systematically reconquered, as are other regions. There is then a delay for the civil war before it's in 70 when Titus, Vespasian is now emperor, will lead the reinforced army to go and besiege Jerusalem. And you have a siege that lasts best part of 3 months, where the city has to be taken section by section, because you have 3 walls that divide off different parts of the city. The third is the weakest, but it's still formidable. The position is also strong. Remember, Jerusalem is on high ground, and that's the reason it's there in the first place. I have a soft spot for Ridley Scott's Kingdom of Heaven film, but his Jerusalem is rather flat, certainly the land around it, which I can understand from the point of view of set design and all this sort of thing, but the real life is not like that. Again, walking around there, getting the feel of the siege, you understand the landscape more. We'll do a more detailed one on the Roman siege of Jerusalem sometime, particularly how the Roman army behaved during it, because it's an interesting test case for how the Roman army of this period actually behaves when it's doing something. So we won't go through that in great detail, but again, there are successes, there are failures, there is a lot of fighting for the Romans to dominate the ground, there are assaults that go in and then get chased out again. As you've had elsewhere, it is not one-sided, it is not easier. This is very costly in casualties. Dio Cassius, writing later, even claims that some Roman soldiers so despair of the siege they desert into the fortress, which gives you an idea of just how hard this was. But eventually the Romans win, and you have prolonged fighting in the temple court. You have the destruction of the temple itself by fire. Josephus presents this as an accident that Titus, even having discussed the matter, didn't want it to happen. What you think about that really depends on wider attitudes to the Roman Empire and Titus. I'm inclined to think it probably was an accident, but one that was very likely, in that the Romans did like to capture big monuments that looked impressive. They didn't need to destroy them. On the other hand, there's an awful lot of gold in there as well. And one of the things Josephus tells us is that the price of gold drops throughout the Mediterranean after the fall of Jerusalem, because so much loot has come onto the market, whether officially or indirectly from the troops that have carried it off. You then have the mopping up Masada and things like that. We've got the videos about Masada elsewhere. The Romans destroy all organised and open opposition to them. It takes a while, a couple of years after Jerusalem that Masada falls, but nevertheless, it does make the point that even if you quite rightly accept the modern view that actually the siege probably doesn't last that long, it's not a question of 6 months, a year or more, it's probably less, it's still a formidable place to take. And there's still a great emphasis. You can go out into the desert, you can go onto this formidable fortress, stay there, not cause any trouble, but we'll still get you. You can't escape, so we will find you, we will get you, whenever we feel like it, we get round to it. Just a reminder that this is the price of rebellion. You will lose, and we will find you whoever you are, and the longer you resist, the more you'll be punished for this. There is, of course, again, look at the Masada video, the emphasis, it rounds off Josephus' book that you have the mass suicide at the end. Is very dramatic and striking because he hasn't done that himself. But Josephus has been trying to encourage defection for a long time before this. Temples destroyed, deliberate or accidental, well, it's hard to say, as we say. For the pattern of later Jewish rebellions are much more poorly recorded. There's no Josephus equivalent. We don't know very much. And when you get into Trajan's reign, Hadrian's reign, those are poorly recorded by narrative sources. The next big rebellion you get is under Trajan during his Parthian expedition, when the Jewish community of Alexandria, Egypt, Cyprus, Cyrenaica, some of the other islands, Crete, they rebel. And this is a very large rebellion with bitter intercommunal fighting between Jewish communities and Gentiles, and serious Roman defeats. Doesn't seem to have any echo in Judea, Galilee, areas like that. Whether that's because Lucius Quietus, the Moorish prince who's become a favourite general of Trajan's and a senator, is sent there to take charge. It might be he just did a very good job, or it might be that people are too exhausted, or they don't necessarily have the fellow feeling with those from the diaspora, the wider community. Under Hadrian, Jerusalem is turned into a Roman colony. He builds first an army base on top of the temple, and then it's going to be turned into a city dedicated to Jupiter. Understandably, this provokes deep bitterness, resentment, and you have the Bar Kokhba rebellion. This is very poorly recorded, but again, for a while, you have an independent Jewish state minting its own coins based in Jerusalem. The Romans, we're told by Dio, don't want to meet the rebels in open battle, and instead this is a war of sieges. They systematically take one stronghold after another. One of the curious features of this that again has cropped up archaeologically is you get the tunnel systems built in and around villages and towns that the rebels are using as bases and for surprise attacks, again mentioned in the sources. So they seem to have prepared for a long attritional war. The problem is in the end the Romans don't go away. But Hadrian is remembered with great bitterness by subsequent Jewish sources. You know, his name's mentioned, it tends to be may his bones rot, this sort of thing, various abuse of that. Galilee doesn't seem to be heavily involved as far as we can tell archaeologically. This seems to be mostly Judea. Egypt doesn't seem to be involved. After this, after Hadrian, you don't get another big rebellion. Now, you could argue from the Talmud and other stuff that there is resistance, there is banditry and all this sort of thing, but it's not clear, it's not open, it doesn't lead to anything big. Now, that could be because the Romans have suppressed the area so effectively that they've taken over. There is not this mass expulsion of the entire Jewish population, though Jerusalem becomes a pagan city. Interesting thing happens in Galilee in that it's harder to see material culture, tableware, other designs as distinctively as Jewish as they were before for centuries, and yet in the late Roman period and afterwards they pop up again very clearly. So it looks as if the tradition is being maintained, it's just you don't do it too openly in case that grabs attention. The pattern with the Jewish population of resistance does seem to be different to the Roman Empire, and you could also add that when the Roman Empire's been and gone, there is still a strong sense of distinctively Jewish identity in a way you just don't get with other ethnic religious groups within the empire. So in the one sense, the Jewish population, both of Judea but also more widely of the diaspora, is unusual from the start. It's also unusual because we have sources from within it, whether it's the Talmudic stuff, broadly speaking the New Testament, Josephus, that sort of context. People who are from within that society talking about it and giving their view of Rome from the other perspective, rather than always from the Roman centre looking out of the provinces. On the other hand, after Hadrian, after Bar Kokhba, there are no more major large-scale rebellions, in part because of the changes to Judea and that Jerusalem becomes a fully Gentile pagan city. We should also note that the garrison of the area, even under the prefects and procurators, when you've got 7 or so auxiliary units, that's quite a lot for a province of that size that isn't on a frontier. After 70, you've got Legio Tenth based at Jerusalem with other auxiliary units. So the provincial garrison has more than doubled, both in quantity but also in the prestige of the troops. You know, a legion offers you higher command structure, more specialists, more engineers, siegecraft abilities, this sort of thing, and the possibility of a field army of 8,000 to 10,000 men if you bring nearly all the garrison into one place. In later periods, the garrison will increase even further when it becomes Syria, Palestina. In later periods, it becomes a 2-legion province. So there is always a significant Roman military presence in that area. Whether it is partly, let alone primarily, there for internal control, Harder to say. At some periods that does seem to be the case. As you go later on, it looks more as if it's part of the wider system of armies on the eastern frontier, with Nero looking towards Parthia and then, even more importantly, Sasanian Persia. You don't, in other areas, have such big concentrations of troops. So you could say that the reason there aren't big rebellions later on is that the Romans make very sure that there are not, by putting enough military manpower in the area to make sure of it. But also the society has changed. You've no longer got the temple as a centre, and obviously that's not there for Bar Kokhba, but it is to a great extent a response to Roman plans to build on that site and not allow them. Of course, this is a second temple. Remember, this has happened before. Temple has been destroyed, you've been able to rebuild it and resume the proper worship there. So only 60 odd years from when it's been destroyed, it wasn't unreasonable to think, oh, well, we can just wait and hopefully it'll be all right. And the Romans have treated us too badly sometimes in the past, so maybe we can get somewhere from there. The resentment against Hadrian's actions clearly are prompted by this Roman clumsy misjudgment and rather blatant display of force that we're going to turn this into our city and you haven't got any prospect of future. So you don't get the big rebellions. You do get a consciousness that continues right the way through the Roman period, even if sometimes archaeologically in some areas, as we mentioned in Galilee, it isn't as obvious as you might expect, but the fact that it can resume later on shows that the tradition is there all the time. Can we generalize from this? Can we actually look and say, well, perhaps there are other parts of the Roman Empire where the army is primarily a force of occupation and it's to do with holding down the population? Again, there's an element of qualification in that there's always at least a legion, and in earlier periods there are 2 legions in Egypt, plus auxiliary troops, and those legions are stationed near Alexandria, very close by. Alexandria is a huge city. It's got a population numbering in hundreds of thousands. Only Antioch is at all on the same scale, and they're both significantly smaller than Rome, but they're both a lot bigger than anything else, any other cities out there in the Roman world. Alexandria was always volatile. We tend to focus on the friction, the violence, the hostility between the Jewish community and Gentile communities, but there do seem to have been sections within the Gentile community as well, and outbreaks of rioting that have nothing to do with hostility towards the Jewish population there. So there are clearly cases where the Roman army is deployed to be ready and available to deal with civil unrest. Whether you would see that civil unrest as primarily directed against Roman rule or actually directed against neighbours that you've lived alongside for generations and you really dislike. So you could argue, of course, the standard thing would be, well, this is what empires do. They divide and conquer. They don't allow and they discourage provincial populations from uniting because otherwise they might become a threat. But again, look back to the early stages of 66 and the Jewish rebellion, how readily neighbouring communities turn on each other, and the background before, and violence between Jew and Samaritan, Jew and Gentile, Samaritan and Gentile, and at times other communities. So there are areas where there are problems with civil disturbances and the army can be used to impose that. I mean, again, think back to the one of the papyri from a soldier in Egypt who's talking about recovering after being hit by a missile during a riot in Alexandria, that area. And the same, the Trajanic rebellion in Egypt, there was lots of intercommunal violence that goes on. And there are other periods. You get the Bukhaloi in Egypt who rebel later in the 2nd century, where they're peoples of the marshes, the Nile Delta, that area, who seem to be as hostile to a lot of the wider civil population as they are to the Romans, and get suppressed that way. They're a group outside. So there are groups like that, and there are also what are termed internal frontiers, often mountainous areas, or like the Nile Delta, areas where there aren't large settlements. It's not the sort of land for cities. It's broken terrain. It's easy to hide. It's easy to disappear. It's hard for soldiers to patrol. Areas of lawlessness. Forests can be like that. Mountains in particular are like this. So Isauria, places like that. And these are probably true. Some of the troop concentrations you get in parts of Britain gradually reduces in Wales, but there are still significant numbers there right the way through when there doesn't seem to be any external threat. In the north, Hadrian's Wall, that area. where you're combining a frontier, but also you're controlling a fairly volatile population. Now, this might be more a case of these people have always fought each other, they've always raided their neighbours, they're just doing what they've always done, they see no reason to stop when the Romans arrive, any more than the peoples of Bactria and elsewhere see any reason to stop doing what they've been doing when Alexander the Great and his successors arrive. And there's a constant reimposition of the authority of central government by violent means, because that's what you have to do. You know, these areas are not settled, but it isn't first and foremost a rebellion against you, it's just that you're trying to restrict their lifestyle. So there probably are areas where this happens and where this is a major task for the Roman army. What's much harder to argue is that this is everywhere, or that this is even the majority experience, because when you come back down to it, the greater part of the provinces, the greater area, sees very few Roman troops in it. And the pattern, particularly in the West, is that you have unwalled cities for a very long time, or with limited defences. They're not felt that they're needed. And you simply don't get that rebellion, you don't get that consciousness. So the Jewish experience is interesting because it gives us a different type of evidence and suggests there may be things more complicated, and that there may be some people out there who are turning to become a Lestis, a bandit, because for political, religious motivation, and that may have happened elsewhere. On the other hand, it doesn't seem to be so widespread. That strong sense of identity, of consciousness as a people distinct, with your own rules, your own faith, your own lifestyle, that when that feels restricted by the imperial power, you can readily resist that and turn against it. That's there, you know, in the whole Next Year in Jerusalem and all this sort of thing. There's that consciousness that goes all the way through. But it is not shared by a lot of peoples within the empire, and most areas do seem to become settled and do seem to become broadly peaceful, which is not to say they never see crime, but that crime had probably more to do with robbing, or people who've ended up excluded from or left mainstream society, and this is how they support themselves. In the same way, you will always have a criminal level, some level of activity, particularly in any organised society. It's always going to be there. That's there with the Roman world. A lot of these things are harder to control and enforce. So it comes back to some of the things we talked about in that great long rant about raiding, when you look at some of the stuff from Apuleius and the like. So broadly speaking, we can go too far, and there is a lot of truth in the idea of the Pax Romana. There is a lot of truth in terms of a settled, prosperous, and largely peaceful and stable empire for long periods. That will then, in later periods, be disrupted increasingly often by Roman civil wars. But those civil wars do not provoke more independence movements either. They're not seen as the opportunity, let's throw off the shackles of Rome and go and do our own thing. There are some groups, the Jews most notable, who keep their distinct identity and resist for longer and in a more organised and more concerted way than most others, but that does seem to be rare and is more to do with their very different religion, history, culture to so many ancient peoples out there within the Roman Empire. So all in all, yes, there's some bits of rebellion. Yes, there are probably some bits of resistance. There may be more that we simply never hear of, and I'm not going to leave any archaeological trace, and certainly there's nothing in the literature. But it's not a constant thing. The Roman Empire survives so long as on the whole it works. And while some of that is the fear factor, the power of the Roman army, the fact that if you do rebel against the Romans, the consequences are appalling, an awful lot more has to do with that Roman ability to incorporate people into the empire, particularly the elites. And the fact that they can't do this with the Jewish population is another reason why they stand out as distinct. Nearly everywhere else, you might find that the Druidic class in Gaul, in Britain, doesn't then become the elite afterwards, or if they do, they discard a lot of aspects of that. But other aristocrats do. Another elite emerges. A lot of the people living in the grand villas discovered in Britain are almost certainly from the indigenous population. They're from the aristocracy. They're either people who've always been part of that, or who've managed to do rather well under the Roman system and replace the existing ones. So there is coercion, certainly, but there is an awful lot more persuasion, far more carrot than stick within the Roman Empire. And on the whole, it works, and it works for such a long time. And ideas of constant resistance, of plotting for independence, again, fall short when you look at what happens afterwards, and nobody does that. They're still desperate to be Roman when the empire falls, because again, it has been there so very long, and in many cases there were not wide nationalistic sentiments either. It's the Romans who talk about Gauls, who talk about Germans, who talk about Iberians, Celtiberians, not those people themselves. So a lot of the order that's imposed comes from the empire, but it's an empire that is very successful, in part because, unlike other empires, it did go out and it made people Roman in a way that most have not. They didn't remain part of the subject population. At least some of them could do rather well out of the imperial system. Anyway, that's it for today. As usual, far longer than intended, but hopefully been of interest. Anyway, that's it. Thanks for watching.